Welcome back, everyone, to the Fly Culture Podcast with me, Pete Tigers. Once in a while, you meet someone special. They don't shout about what they've done, but you quietly listen and suddenly the stories come out. I've so wanted to get my guest, Philip Pinney, on the podcast for quite some time now because I've been on a couple of fishing trips with him. He's wonderful company. He's a wonderful angler and he's done some amazing things. These are stories that are too good not to be able to share. So I'm really excited to welcome Philip Pinney to the podcast today. Philip, it's lovely to catch up with you as always. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Peter. It's very kind of you, and the words wonderful and amazing you're using far too much. I have 80 in a few years, and I've fished for over 80 years. I think that's probably my sole claim to fame, but I've enjoyed it, and I hope I can help you.
I'm really looking forward to being able to share your stories with people today. Can you just, for starters, tell us roughly where we are in the part of the world, and what does that mean from a fishing perspective for you?
Well, I sort of really live about as far from the sea as you can get in the UK, equidistant from the Wash, the tidal Thames, the Bristol Channel and the South Coast, which means that if I want to go fishing, I have to drive quite a long way, either north to Scotland or west to Wales or southwest to Cornwall, and of course down to Hampshire, chasing the fish there. It's a nice central point, and I've been able to pursue the pastime really for a long time.
And I'd like to go and take a look at your timeline and start at the very beginning. And you were brought up in New Zealand. How did your father arrive there?
Well, my father was the second son of a family of 6 living in Dorset, and they only had a very small estate, and quite obviously in those days the estate went to the firstborn. So after leaving Oxford, my father had done lots of climbing and lots of fishing and loved the outdoor life. He thought I must get a job, and the 2 teaching jobs he was offered, one was in Upper Canada College in Toronto, and the other was at Christ College in Christchurch in New Zealand. And when he looked at a map, he realised that the mountains, which he loved climbing, were rather a long way away from Toronto, about 3,000 miles further on, whereas in New Zealand, the mountains and the fish were all close by. And he went out there and taught for 2 years and then began farming. And he basically went there because of fishing and climbing.
And did that mean that you were fishing from a young age?
Well, I don't know what age I started walking, but I believe it's before you're 1. And I don't know what age I first had a fly rod in my hand, but it was probably also before 1. But certainly, I think we walked and we started fly fishing at about the same age. Probably with not much skill.
And did you receive a schooling in a traditional sense and a schooling in fishing too?
A very unusual schooling in that because we were on a remote farm, New Zealand had correspondence course, and until I was 9.5, I was actually living on our farm on the coast of Otago, doing correspondence course. But of course my parents would then take me out and we'd go fishing and things like that, which was fun. And then I was sent to a prep school in South Canterbury called Waihi. And although I have great respect for Waihi and the education it gave, which is wonderful, I always used to anger the headmaster for many, many years thereafter by saying it was actually the best fly fishing school in the world. And the reason I say that, it was in a remote part. There were about 60, 70 pupils at the time. And within a mile or 2 of Waihi, there were about 5 lovely little streams, all with lots of little brown trout. Totally wild, of course. And we used to have to go to church 6 times a week and twice on Sunday. And when we went on Sunday, we used to put the gut under our tongue during the service so you could soak it. In those days, of course, we had to use gut rather than the modern nylon. And you had to be careful on high notes so you didn't swallow it. And then we'd pick up a bag of lunch and go off in 1s, 2s or 3s to these rivers. And all the fishing was dry fly, cockabonders, black gnats, Hardy's favourites, and you would just go along these little streams looking for risers and catch them. I think the bag was a dozen in those days, which is far too many for a little boy. And the fish were very small. I think 7 inches was takeable, and a pound was probably the biggest we ever caught. But they were fantastic days out, and you go out and have to be back in the evening for church. And you'd bring back your fish that you caught, carve your initials or whatever it was in the tail, or take off a dorsal fin, and the next morning at breakfast they'd be provided by the cook, and you give them to your best friends. It was a wonderful way of learning. Best fishing school in the world.
And for you, did that make you realise you were obviously destined to be a fly angler, but at that stage, did you realise fly fishing was going to be for you and it was going to be something that was going to stay with you?
I think it was our sort of major hobby. Obviously, we played cricket and, like everyone in New Zealand, rugby, which of course is called football in New Zealand. Yes, but it was just a secondary hobby. If you went away and you passed a lovely river, you would stop on any bridge and you'd look and you'd spot the fish. And if you had time, you would get out of the car and you'd go and catch them.
And that traditionally spotting fish in New Zealand is the way that you going about fishing. Did you realise that was the way to do it even at that young age?
Yes, and what one was aware, in New Zealand they have what was called then the Queen's Chain, or the King's Chain before the Queen came to power in 1953. And that's 22 yards, as I remember, at either side of a stream. So if you wanted to go and fish that stream, you either had to ask the farmer for permission to walk across to it, or you could drive to where a bridge went over the stream and you can walk 22 yards to the left or right of it, as long as the whole way up the river if you wanted to. So anyone could actually fish publicly. And so that's the way one was brought up.
And you talked about some of the fly patterns earlier. Were you tying flies at that stage as well?
Oh, yes, we tied our own flies as well. And we tied our flies and had lovely little sort of 7-foot rods, and great fun. And we had other challenges as well, I remember. Not all fishermen are totally following the rule. On a very hot day, I remember sitting on a wool scouring bridge where all the water came out, and sitting eating our sandwiches on a hot day, and we hadn't caught any fish. So we'd flick bread in the water, which of course you should never do. And then the final piece of bread would have a fly in it. But that worked out well. And then the other thing we used to love coming back to school was a super apple orchard with the most beautiful apples in it. And the farmer got so fed up, he put a large barbed wire fence around it that you could not climb over. So the final cast of the day used to be to put on a big fly and then see if you could hook the apple through its stalk and bring it back over the fence. And it was really a very expert cast, almost better than catching a fish.
And I guess that probably helped you with your trout fishing as well, or accuracy as well, didn't it?
That's what it's all about, absolutely.
And so once you left school, what happened next in your life?
Well, I think I can carry forward. I then went to secondary school in New Zealand where we did a little fishing, but it was still all on the rivers of the plains, small rivers. And my last holiday in New Zealand, we went down to Southland, and I remember catching a 2.5 pounder and feeling absolutely thrilled. And I'd been sent to a useless place on the river. My brother and father went to the best place, of course. And that fish was actually the biggest fish we'd caught in New Zealand during my youth. And my father, when he went out, was catching 6, 7, 8 pounders. And tremendous lot of that. But these were in bigger rivers, whereas we were just fishing the little rivers of the plains. And I remember that 2.5 pounder was the biggest fish I had in New Zealand when I left.
And was there much of an adjustment fishing those slightly bigger rivers then, for you're used to those small, intimate little streams?
Well, I didn't fish them at that time. I then came over to England, and the little rivers of England are very similar to the little rivers of New Zealand. The big rivers, I went back to New Zealand 5 years later for a holiday, and had a wonderful holiday. My brother and an English cousin and I drove all the way around the South Island and we went to backcountry lakes, backcountry rivers, and it was a new thing. Different flies, bigger flies, backcountry lakes. We'd often sit up high in the bank, and you'd find an area with a bit of sand offshore, and often one would put a nymph, which I had never used in my youth at all, on that sand, and then when big fish cruised around, you just move it on the sand, and the fish would suck it up, and the battle would begin. So there was a lot of that, and in lakes, and then we went to big backcountry rivers, where you would walk up and down with a pair of Polaroids, just spotting, and you would, if you saw a good fish, then you'd try and catch it.
And you did mention about coming to the UK. What brought you to the UK?
I got a scholarship in my last year at school because I was the second son on a small farm and my brother was going to get the farm. I had to earn my keep somewhere else. And I'd always enjoyed flying and got a flying scholarship when I was, I think, 15 or 16 and got my private pilot's license and things. So I really wanted to join the Air Force and make a career there. And just before I finished school at 18, I got a scholarship and I went from boarding school to boarding a ship and sailing to England in 13 days. And it wasn't 13 uneventful days. I had a week flying Harvards in between to prove that it was worth the investment sending me over there. Thank goodness it was.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to come on to your career shortly, but you've alluded to the fishing in the UK and you're settling into the UK. Were you quickly looking for fishing?
When I first came to England, my relations in Dorset took me fishing, and I had some and enjoyed it, caught some fish, but probably only 1 or 2 days per year. I spent much of my time taking expeditions to the Pyrenees, climbing, skiing, and travelling far and wide. And really, I found it very odd that you would have to pay for a river. You couldn't just look over a bridge and see a fish. You had to plan it ahead. And the way of life we had, because we were zooming here and there, often at short notice, I just found it wasn't compatible with my way of life at the time. So I didn't really fish much for 5 years. And I paid the price. When I went back to New Zealand on that first holiday, I'd almost forgotten how to catch a fish. But I did learn again.
And did that reinvigorate you for when you came back to the UK to say, right, okay, I'm going to pack the fly rod a little bit more? And where you were fishing in Dorset, you say, where else were you heading to?
Well, after that, my 3 years I'd spent in Germany, so I didn't do much fishing there. And I'd done a little fishing in the Pyrenees. So when I came back from New Zealand after the 5 years, I was posted up to Cranwell as a flying instructor. And that, of course, is only about 1 hour from the Anglian lakes of Rutland, which hadn't yet been built, and Grafham. And lots of fishing friends there loved going down. So we did go down quite often of a weekend. And the first weekend that Grafham opened, I remember we fished. And it was explosive. There's no other word for it. You caught very big fish, and they were incredibly wild. So I did do quite a bit of reservoir fishing at that time, because that's what you could do in Lincolnshire, which is rather too flat for chalk streams.
And from a reservoir point of view, I guess that was almost the halcyon days, or the explosion of the stillwater scene in the UK. Did you sort of get a sense that was happening? And you mentioned Rutland, Grafham, those sorts of places. Were you seeing them really well populated with anglers as well?
Yes, because instead of living in New Zealand with rivers all around you, or in Dorset with access to rivers, if you're in Lincolnshire, there are wonderful lakes around in that area. And as a result, my friends who fished tended to be reservoir fishermen, because that's what they could do. So we had great fun doing that. And the only exceptions really were when we decided to go, the cousin I'd fished with in New Zealand, and I decided to go to Ireland for a mayfly week on Loch Conn. And there was a New Zealand school friend of mine I'd fished with at home, and off we went and had one of the most incredible weeks of my life. We were camping by the edge of Loch Con. It was the height of the mayfly season, and we probably caught 3, 4, 5 fish per day, with perhaps one of 4 or 5 pounds. And that was for the first few days. And then suddenly one day, looking over the edge of the boat, I noticed a nose come up, which wasn't a trout. And it took the fly and departed. Unfortunately, not mine, but my friend's. And he caught a salmon. That was rather fun. After lunch, we caught another one. And I think that day was one of the best fly fishing days I've ever had in my life. I think we had a 4 or 5 pound sea trout, 2 salmon, and some wonderful brownies as well. And those were just very special.
I hear about those amazing mayfly hatches. And did you experience the children collecting the mayflies for anglers as well to dap with? Were you seeing that on Loch Con?
Yes, yes. I mean, we were fishing on the boat most of the time, but not all the time. And you were going around, and if you saw a mayfly hatch, you'd watch it, see what they're taking, and then cruise in quietly and see if you could catch them.
Wonderful. Did you try dapping?
Oh, yes. We tried that, and I've tried it subsequently in life, and with a floss line and a very long rod. And the chap who was looking after us, Ned Mulhern, was a lovely gilly. He had an extendable rod of about 20 feet, and he would bounce a big fly on the water in the wind, and the fish, of course, would take him mid-air. And that was almost more exciting than anything else. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it's something I've still not ticked the box on, and it's something I really, really would love to do.
Maybe we'll do it next summer.
Yeah, perhaps we will. I would very much like to have a try, that's for sure. And being in a boat with you, I'd thoroughly enjoy as well. So you've talked a lot about the still waters, which, we often associate New Zealand with rivers, and you've talked about some of the lakes that you fish there. So were there other rivers that you were fishing? Was your head turned a little bit by the growing still water scene, the lochs of Ireland, or did you find yourself on some rivers too?
No, in Ireland, we also went to Connemara and fished in rivers, and Donegal and fished in rivers. So, no, we did experience those. And when I went over to Wales, which I quite often did because I also like climbing, I'd always have a rod in the car and turn up at the local garage. Can I see fish here? And what amazed me is that you could buy a day ticket or something, and often we would go on Saturday night, fish until midnight, and it was good fun. So yes, I did quite a lot of fishing, particularly in Wales, just isolated rivers for a day at a time.
It fascinates me that you talk about climbing and fishing, and I know a number of people who have climbed and fish. Is there some form of connection there that you detect? Is it the outdoors, or is it something deeper than that?
I think it's you're competing with nature, rather than games like golf and things where you're just competing with another human being. I think it's just people who love open spaces, mountains, beautiful rivers, scenery, animals, and they just competing with nature and enjoying it.
What a beautiful way to put it. That's very moving and wonderful. I wanted to move on to your career now, and you said that you got a scholarship. Can you tell us how your career developed within the RAF?
Yes, well, I mean, the first decision I had to make was, should I join the RAF or the RNZAF? And various of my friends joined the RNZAF. They had a wonderful career and enjoyed it in the most beautiful part of the world. And they continued to ask me, why did I want to come over here? But against that, in Europe, you were flying in the middle of the world, often the most modern aircraft in the world, in a very real environment. And I basically flew right through the Cold War. And I'm a firm believer that what we did was right, in that through the Cold War, we had the longest period of peace in Europe, probably for 1,000 years. And when it ended in November 1989 and the Berlin Wall came down, a lot of professors and things said, oh, there'll be peace in our time forever now, to which we said, no, there won't. And we were right. About a few months later, you have Kosovo and all the problems blew up, and there have been problems ever since, up to Ukraine today.
What was it you were flying, Philip?
When I started, we learned to fly on the Piston Provost and the Vampire jet. And then my first tour I did on Canberra low-level strike aircraft, based in Germany on the Canberra B-8, which is a wonderful role. It was in the strike role, which is the heavy role, 17 minutes from the East German border. And we would stand on alert for 24 hours, probably once or twice a week, ready to go at 15 minutes' notice. So it was, at the age of 21, it was quite a responsibility being captain of a nuclear bomber, with just one other chap with you. And you'd be on duty for 24 hours with your helmet in the cockpit, ready to go. And so that was that. I did 3 years there, and then became a flying instructor and did 2 years at Cranwell when I was talking about the fishing a moment ago, and then went back to Central Flying School, which is where they train instructors. And I was doing that, and then I got a strange call one day to go and have an interview with various very senior officers, got more and more senior. And I found myself appointed as the flying instructor to teach Prince Charles, then Prince of Wales, how to fly. And that began the summer before you went to Cambridge. We flew down to Tangmere and started flying then. And then I basically went with him right through Cambridge, which included one term at Aberystwyth before the investiture in Wales. So I had 2.5 years, and it was a very interesting experience. And then later on in my career, I got back onto the same role I've been doing on Canberras, but now they were on Buccaneers, based in England, and assigned to fight in North Norway. And that gave me a most wonderful chance, because the Buccaneers could do air-to-air refueling, and we used to fly over to Labrador, to Goose Bay, to do low-level training there. I went twice down to Nevada for the exercise Red Flags, the first foreigners ever to do it. And we also flew the first maple flag exercise in Alberta in Canada. So we got a lot of experience.
Philip's being incredibly modest, as he always is, and I know when you went down to Nevada, this is, for listeners, from what I've gathered, I've sort of heard a little bit of this story before, but it basically is literally the best of the best. How did you fare in that, Philip?
I think it's what the public normally call Top Gun, except Top Gun was a film about Navy, but we were fighting against them. They were one of the Red Forces against us, and the American Air Force Aggressor Squadron, which flew planes that were painted the same as MiGs and operated the same tactics. They were our enemies, of something 50 to 100 of them in the air against us. And we were the good blue forces, and basically we could fly over an area which was Utah and Nevada and a bit of California, and some of Arizona as well, which is about the size of Wales and Scotland, or really all the north of England, north of UK put together. And we were allowed to fly as fast as you could go, which in our case is fairly high subsonic, at 100 feet, and you could drop any weapon other than a nuclear weapon against real live targets. So the Americans have built this red flag exercise as a result of lessons they learnt in Vietnam, when they used to post crews to go to Vietnam for 100 sorties, and they found they were more likely to be shot down in the first 10 than they were in the remaining 90. So in Nevada, the red flag, they tried to recreate the first 10. And we had against us captured Soviet guns, captured Soviet missiles, captured Soviet radars, all of these things. And whilst they didn't actually shoot live rockets at us or missiles, they would send the same electronic signal, and they had a video recording of everything, and we had to carry a pod in our aircraft, which would be read by transmitters on the ground. So you could replay where you were within 3 feet at any point. So if I had a battle with an F-15, after we landed, if he claimed me, I said, no, you didn't. We could actually replay my cockpit to his, or his cockpit to mine, and achieve something that Air Forces of the world really never achieved before, is getting an honest fighter pilot. No, it was fantastic. And when we went, we had a very good aircraft. And the first day, we put 12 aircraft through the range, and no aircraft had ever gone through the range with these transmitters on. And we went through, and they'd not seen any of us. And I actually got summoned to see the general. So basically, why did my squadron come all this way and not fly through the range? So the next day, I had to stay with him in the command post and watch these traces. And I asked for him to give me the position of one ground station. And I said, I'll put an aircraft over it within 5 seconds and tell him which it will be and what the time was. And the second ground station, we did the same again. And I bet him a bottle of champagne that we'd be within 5 seconds. And the first aircraft appeared about 3 seconds before and disappeared 3 seconds afterwards. Oh, thank goodness, because I was sitting there getting worried as time got closer. And the other one, I hate to say, was about 7 seconds out. So I got the navigator to buy the bottle of champagne.
Amazing. That sounds just extraordinary. And you talk about, and I know you love those Buccaneers so much, and from what I gather, they're just subsonic, about 800 mile an hour, is it they travel?
About 0.9 the speed of sound. And if you're flying in Nevada at 7,000 feet at temperatures over 110 degrees, your actual real speed was then about 700 miles an hour, 100 foot above the ground, so it was quite fast. And it was quite an experience. We were very lucky.
For listeners and myself as well, what is that experience like? How can you describe it to us that are never going to experience those moments?
You concentrate. We had to take off almost at dawn or before dawn every morning because the airfield at Nellis was 2,000 feet above sea level, and jet performances fall as you go higher and higher, and it also falls as you get hotter and hotter, and we have both. You'd often land having lost half a stone of weight or something, but you just concentrated, you did your job, and you had the best training environment in the world. And at that time, we had one of the best aircraft in the world. So it was a wonderful moment to actually be flying a British aircraft.
What an amazing story. I want you to rewind a tiny bit, because you said that you taught Prince Charles at the time, King Charles, to fly. But I believe you also did some fly fishing with him too. Yes,
well, we had the main time when we really were together, most of all, was the 3 months before the investiture when he was at Aberystwyth. And I took my aircraft and my small ground crew over to Aberporth, which is a little grass airfield near Cardigan. And he used to come and spend various weekends in the tiny mess at Cardigan. I think they only had 5 or 6 people living in it. And it suited the security very well because it was the height of IRA troubles and there was quite a bit of Welsh nationalist opposition. So he would have the weekends with us, and we'd fly on Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, do ground school and things. But eventually, if one got tired, we'd then either go walking in the hills or go swimming in the beach, or better still, take a fishing rod. And I suppose I'm rather unkind, but my wife came over and stayed with me for about 2 or 3 of those months, and we rented a cottage right on the edge of the Teivi, which had sea trout, so we could catch sea trout before breakfast, which was always very nice. And because my pupil was a fairly well-known person in Wales, various river owners invited me to come fishing in the hope that they might get Prince Charles to come too. And indeed, we had one wonderful day when we'd flown and were utterly exhausted. Let's go fishing. And I remember walking across a huge field, and it's the first time I've ever actually watched a person doing spey casting, and he was fishing absolutely beautifully. Alas, he didn't catch a fish that day, but we had great fun, and it whet my appetite. And a few days before the investiture, I went back myself with my wife, who was heavily pregnant with our first child, and I had a bet that I'll try and catch a salmon bigger than your producer baby. And I confess, I got my first salmon. I hate to say it was spinning, because I was told it wasn't suitable for a fly in that water height. And I got a 16-pounder. So my wife was rather cross because the bet was called off.
And was Prince Charles he's a passionate angler?
He loved it. And at that time, and he obviously fished up in Scotland when he went up to Balmoral a lot. And I think he'd been taught mostly by the Queen Mother, who was a passionate angler herself. And having been brought up in Scotland, she knew all about that. And no, he was a super angler. And shortly before the investiture, he arrived with a big smile on his face one day and said, "Look at this letter I've got from the press secretary," Bill Heseltine as it was then. And he was going with Princess Anne to do a tour of New Zealand just after the investiture, just not an official one, just a private tour. And this letter said, "You're going to have a weekend staying with the Acklands at Mount Peel." Well, that happened to be only about 3 or 4 miles from where my parents lived. And on Friday, you'll go stalking with one of the Ackland boys and hopefully get a red dam. And on Saturday, you'll go fishing with Mr. Robert Pinney up the Rangitata, and hopefully you'll catch a 10-pound trout. And then on Sunday, you better learn about farming because there's a conference on Monday. And anyway, so this was all geared up, and he was thrilled about this. And unfortunately, on the day, there was a northwest wind blowing, and in England, we get things that stop us fishing. In New Zealand, a warm northwest wind just is impossible. And he went up to the river. They saw the fish, but he was unable to catch it. And fortunately, a week later, he went to the North Island and had some wonderful fishing and did catch some very good fish there. And when I saw him last, just before the the coronation, he chuckled quietly and wondered why I was looking rather brown. I said, "I've just come back from New Zealand. And yes, I did go up the Rangitata. And yes, I did raise a very large trout. In fact, it was off about 2 or 3 seconds. And I'm sure it was a grandson of the royal fish that he never caught. And he's crossed. But he reminded me that as Rotorua, he caught lots of fish anyway, so he was very proud."
Fantastic. And you mentioned his grandmother as well. And did you get to fish with her, or did you get a sense of her?
I never fished with her, but in my subsequent tour, I was station commander of Benson and deputy captain of the Queen's Flight. And in the course of that, I flew all the Royals and various places. And one of my final flights was, I think, after the Queen Mother's 102nd birthday. She used to have the birthday party in Clarence House, and the guards would play Happy Birthday and there'd be a parade, and then she would come out and we'd fly her up to Wick in the north of Scotland, and she'd go to Castle of May. And anyway, I was selected to do that day, and the equerry gave me a call and said, "The Queen Mother wishes you to have lunch with her in the aircraft." So that's fine. But she's quite old now, so you mustn't stay for more than 20 minutes. Just take your leave and go. So fine, sir. I did exactly as I told. After 20 minutes, I wiped my mouth and stood up. "Sit down." No, we were talking, needless to say, about fishing in New Zealand. And she was telling me all the things she had done. And about 10 minutes later, the equerry's face appeared around the door again. And she said, "He's going to stay here until he's finished this meal." So off the Equerry went. And indeed, when we landed at Wick, the red carpet was rolled out, and we actually stayed at the table for about another 2 or 3 minutes until she had finished all the wonderful tales of her fishing life, which was very, very wonderful.
What a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. You said that you've travelled with work to many places. Did you always, with work, you mentioned Labrador, would that mean that you would be able to fit a fly rod in the suitcase?
Well, those who don't know Goose Bay was much the same latitude as Honington and Suffolk, but people think it's in the far, far north. It's very remote. I think the nearest road is about 500 miles away, and the nearest railway is about 300. And the boats come in and supply everything, or planes come in. But when we were flying there, where we could fly low level all around without disturbing people, and that's why we did a lot of our 100-foot training before going out to Nevada, the Canadians thought if one of us had a problem or something, they sent up a float plane to act as search and rescue if anything happened during that month. And the float plane reward, he was a reserve pilot in the Canadian Air Force, was he could take the float plane one weekend and go where he wanted to with a reasonably short flight. And he was a fisherman. So we quickly assembled a few fishermen. And in fact, he was a spinning man, and there were 2 other spinners, and there were 2 of us who were fly fishermen. And we flew off to a remote lake and camped and had some of the best fishing. It was just fantastic. We were catching brook trout up to about the biggest, I think, was 4 pounds. The average weight probably about 2. And we had 2 canoes. And the interesting thing is, with those of us with flies, we're averaging about a pound and a half bigger per fish than those with spinning. And one of the greatest fishing moments of my life was when we, after fishing on the Sunday morning, before we were going to have to fly home late that afternoon back to Goose Bay, we went to the exit of the lake, and there was a deep channel going out with high banks either side, and the water was about 20 foot deep. And from the high banks, you could look straight down through the water and see big fish holding on the bottom. Ho, ho, so the people with the spinning rods put on spinners and let them down and pull them past the fish. And because we're watching from above, you can actually see the fish looking not very excited. And then we started dapping flies on top. And you would see that the tails were immediately starting to twitch and they're getting interesting. So, ha-ha. So we went on and then started bouncing the flies a bit more. And then suddenly one of the fish took off and came way out of the water with the fly in its mouth, and we landed it. And half an hour later, the greatest triumph was the people with the spinning rod took their spinners off, they tied on a fly, and they dapped with a fly. And both of them caught a fish. And I thought that was probably a moment of truth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's move on a little bit more as well. And after you left the RAF, you decided that you wanted to concentrate more so on salmon. What made you want to make that decision?
That is not necessarily a true deduction. When I left the RAF, the day I put in my papers to retire, and it had just been taken from my old tray, and suddenly 35 years later I was being thrown out on the market. A phone rang and a chap said, "Would you like to come and fish the test and have a rod in our syndicate?" So, and the day I retired, actually I was fishing at Chilbolton on the test, and it was just sort of prophetic. The papers which had been taken away said 22nd of May, and he offered the first rod 22nd of May, so someone knew something. And I had about 20 years there and have fished around the south of England ever since. But when I was about to leave the RAF, I had a wonderful week up at Ballindalloch chasing salmon as a guest of a friend. And I also went with another person who used to be senior pilot in British Airways and a Battle of Britain bomber pilot in World War II. And he invited me up to the Carron, and we had, again, super fishing there. So with those two experiences, I thought, well, perhaps I should try salmon fishing. And I went back to the Carron for 3 years, and we had great success, really. And I went to the Arn near Ballindalloch on the Spey again for a couple of years, and we had lots. And really we formed a group of friends we rudely call the A-Team, which I fish with to this day. And apart from you, Peter, who's joined us recently, it's really been a very stable team. And but we realized, coming to fish the Spey and things, that really I'd never fished with a 15-foot rod. I didn't know how to Spey cast, and one had a lot to learn. And so 2 or 3 of us who'd fished these rivers over those 2 years thought, well, why don't we actually buy a week somewhere? And we went up and drove around Scotland and to the North Esk, to do 2 beats on the Spey, and to Mersley 2 on the Tay. And whilst the Tay is absolutely enormous and it's terrifying really to a person who hasn't fished a big rod, the gilly there, Tony Black, was a brilliant fisherman, and clearly one could learn more from him than probably anywhere else. So I bought a gross week, the end of June, July, and beginning of July, and which I kept for the next 13 years. And that was a sort of a great experience for me. And the chap who came up with me, he bought an autumn week in September. So he would come on my weeks and I'd go on his. And for the next 13 years, we had fantastic fishing and eventually learned to Spey cast, some with much more skill than others, and certainly I was not one of those. But I ceased to be frightened of not being able to cast 100 yards, and I realized you could actually catch a fish at 30 yards. And so once I got used to the big river, it was fun. But my heart was actually in smaller rivers, and it always has been. But before I let that develop, we'd been up to Tolkien on the Spey. We'd been fishing Middle Blackhore and Kenton on the Dee, and the Bewley, and various rivers up in northern Scotland. And I really enjoyed the smaller rivers more than the big. But before I gave it up, someone, John Maitland, who used to fish for the English Fly Fishing Association, I think, and I thought, well, why don't we go to Russia and have one go? The Cold War was over, and we could actually go back to the Kola and fish as friends. So we flew up there and had a week on the Koloska and the Litzer rivers, and it was amazing. The first fish I caught was 23 pounds on the first evening. I had about 320 yards of line, including backing, and I think the reel got down to about 3 rings of line left on the reel at the furthest point. And eventually, when I wound it in, it was exhausted, and so was I, but we put it back. And it was a fantastic week. Not a place for young men, for old men, huge rocks and things, but great fun. And the year later, we couldn't possibly afford to go again, but we thought, well, our bones won't be able to do it again if we don't go now. So we went the next year as well, and that was equally good. And I think got 12 or 13 fish each year. I personally did, but I probably lost twice as many as that, which means you have about 40 fish on in 6 days, which is considerably more than you would expect in Scotland. And they were quite large fish. So it was terrific fun. And I then was lucky enough, actually, about 8 years later, Mike Daunt, who had taken me up on the first time I went up, phoned me and said, oh, they're just starting a camping holiday up there, which is about a quarter of the cost, but it's totally unsuitable for elderly people. So I booked the next day. And I had my 70th birthday up there, and Arthur Volker, who I taught to fish, had his 21st. So we went up, and there were 2 Icelandics, 2 Spaniards, 2 of us, and 3 Russian guides. And we had 4 days on the Litzer and then the same on the Rinder, on Koloska. And it was just magic because we weren't using helicopters other than to get into the river and get out after those days. So we were walking up and down, seeing all the Arctic animals, and we had less fish, but it was really absolutely spiritual. And so that was the end of my big river fishing, really, but it was great fun.
You mentioned the Cold War there, and of course your role within the RAF. When you first arrived, was it were you thinking about those things a little bit?
Of course we have, because I would have fought on the Buccaneers from Bodo and Andoya and the other airfields right up in the Arctic Norway. So I, shall we say, knew quite a bit about the Kola Peninsula. And indeed, on the final trip I went, our camping trip, my guide was a person who had actually served on one of the bases, which I knew quite well, but I'd never actually seen, of course. And so going camping with him for a week was really sort of a spiritual release of the end of one's career. And how lovely to go fishing together rather than having to bomb each other.
And I wanted to move on a little bit because I know about your logbooks as well, and you keep really detailed accounts of your fishing. Is that fun to do? And do you go back to them from time to time and have a read of them too?
I would love to say yes. I started off with little fishing books at prep school, and they came slightly bigger when I started over here, and then I got 2 of them. Then I got a really big one, which lasted for about the first 15 years after I retired from the Air Force when I was doing lots of fishing. And since then, I hate to say I've kept most things on computer records, which statistically is very good, but it's not actually as satisfying as sitting down in the evening and writing and sticking a photo in. So I wish I'd done it better.
And let's talk about, there's so much more fishing that you're going and planning to do, but you've taught so many people and introduced over the years so many people into fishing, haven't you?
Well, really through trout fishing, because I've been lucky enough to learn at a young age. Nothing gives me more pleasure than taking my children out, and when they were very young, 3 girls, I knew various people who were invited up for wonderful parties in Scotland, and the girls would sit and watch, and the boys would go and catch fish. So I was determined that my 3 daughters would be competent, and indeed all of them have caught a lot of very good trout and were regular trout fishermen around here and elsewhere. And so when my youngest hooked, I think it was 11-pounder, her first fish, there was no wish to take the rod back or anything. She was totally capable and could do it far better than me.
And for you, from a fishing perspective, trout or salmon?
Where? Probably the best trout. If I go to a backcountry New Zealand river, I walk 2 or 3 miles along and eventually choose the best trout, sit and watch it for 20 minutes and find out what it's doing, put on the right fly, and then eventually hook it, is probably as pure a form of sport as you can do. As against that, up in Sutherland and northern Scotland, I've had the most fantastic fishing because the rivers are very like a New Zealand mountain stream, quite small, but the quarry is salmon. And by going back to various rivers again and again, you get to know all the pools at various heights, how the depth and so forth. And I've taken many a person, young and old, and go along and you sort of tell them where to put the first cast, and they haven't caught a fish for 5-6 years, and bang, it's just wonderful. And I get actually much more satisfaction in later life, shall we say, of putting people onto those fish and watching them catch and the joy. But what's the best, salmon or trout? I'd say they're equal. I enjoy them both. But I just enjoy fishing with a small rod whether it's for trout or salmon. And I think some of the best fish I've ever had have not been on the places like the Tay, where I've had various 20-pounders and spey. But it's on little rivers with perhaps a 10-foot rod and a 14 or 16 size fly catching a 20-pounder. And that to me is about the ultimate. If I caught a 20-pound trout, I'd probably say the same, but I haven't.
And testament to Philip's skills as well. Somewhere that I've fished with Philip, somebody new came along, I think it was last year, did incredibly well. And in the evening, I was congratulating him, and he said, well, I was just really lucky. He said, all I did was what Philip told me to do, and I caught fish. So James was incredibly pleased to be gilled and guided by yourself. So that's a testament to your skills, isn't it?
It's just, I've been back there quite often. You get to know the water, you get to know the height, and you know that if you do the right thing, which I hope you'll do on 95 to 99% of your casts, that it could be a fish at the other end. And if you haven't done the right thing, your line is hooked over the reel or something like that, you're not going to catch it. It's got to be 100%. And the Russian guides, in a way, taught me that. I got very cross when I was up there, and I put on, they needed a fast sink tip or something, and I just bought some new ones before leaving England, put on this fast sink tip. And the guide immediately put a hook out of his sort of a metal bar hook out of his belt and hooked it around my extension lead, the tippet, and broke it. And I thought, I've just bought that. That's ridiculous. But then I realized it was a 40-pound trout, a salmon at the other end. Thank God he broke it rather than the salmon.
Yeah. You've been fishing a long, long time now. And I just wondered, in your fishing career, what is the biggest innovation that you have seen?
Well, the big variation I've seen, of course, is fishing in New Zealand, which is all public, and in parts of Canada, which has been too, whereas here's not. The reservoir fishing is something I knew nothing about, and the expertise of reservoir fishermen I admire. I'm not going to try and replicate it because I never could equal them, but there's huge expertise. And of course, the other thing is the kit. I always used to use a split cane rod, little 7-foot split cane to start with. And then when the space race came in and we started getting modern rods, the capability is totally different. They're lighter and more capable. Then the next change I had was really in reels. When I was fishing for salmon with a little 10-foot rod, you need to have a reel which can cope, because you can't just do it with anything else. So that was a big change for me, having to get really good modern reels which could cope. And of course, the lines are just incredible now. And I know a good fisherman does forward and back, forward and back, forward and back, and does it wonderfully. The way I always try and fish is lift it up with a whole lot of line at your feet and throw it forward once. And the fly will finish, hopefully 6 inches above the water, and just plop on.
Wonderful. I hope it's okay to say that you're 86 now, but to me, your enthusiasm and love of our pastime burns so bright, doesn't it?
I think, the joy about being old is you get young people to come up in your fishing parties, and all my children sort of love fishing, and young people like Arthur Volk, who I talk to fish, is now probably the best person I've seen, and sort of the child is father of the man. It's just lovely to see how people get it. And even when you're old and you can't walk far and can't climb the highest mountain, you can still go out, you can still enjoy the golden eagle flying overhead, or the ospreys, and all the wild animals and things. It's sure glorious. And I just feel very lucky.
Is there somewhere you'd still love to cast a fly line?
Is there somewhere?
Yeah.
I want to cast a fly everywhere. No, I mean, there's nothing more joyful than going along a river, spotting a fish, working at what it's doing, work out how to get it, and then catch it. And if it's too easy, try and catch a more difficult one. I think, in a way, I learnt a lot of that with John Maitland, who came to Russia with me and used to fish for the English fly fishing team. On the test, we used to walk up and down, spot fish. And I can't remember how many were allowed. I think it was 5 a day or something. And if John was fishing, I'd give a mark out of 10 of the fish that he was trying to catch. And if it was just in the middle of the river and easily, I'd give it a 2 or 3. And if it was under a tree, needed a curved line, twitching and so forth, he could get up to 9 or 10. And eventually, when we used to go there on good days, we wouldn't fish unless someone had given us a 7 or 8 or 9. It was just the challenge of overcoming nature and catching a really good fish or a difficult fish to catch.
And I know when I fish with you in the summer that your niece, Sarah, along with Rob, is along, and she has got that passion that I guess you've had a big impact on her fishing career too, haven't you?
Sarah, is my niece, my brother's daughter. My brother last died at the age of 50. And when I used to go out to the farm in Southland the first time, Sarah used to be my gilly. I think she was then aged 4. And we'd go up the river, little creek, spotting fish, and she had an absolute perfect eyesight for finding them. And when we'd find a fish on some narrow stream, may only be 5 feet wide or something, I would hide on my side, and she would go 200 yards downstream, cross over and come up the other, and then crawl in, looking down, and tell me where to put the fly. And I just watched the fly coming, and it's coming up, it's coming up. She'd say, it's coming up. And the first thing I'd see was the open mouth closing over my fly. And so she taught me at a very young age. And then my brother died, and I thought, well, at least fishing competitions in our family are over forever. But I hate to say now that Sarah's even worse than her father. She's the keenest, and she's a very good fisherwoman.
Absolutely, and her flies are magnificent, aren't they?
She's super, and her husband matches her. They're a very great fishing couple.
Absolutely, I can only echo that as well. Well, we've spoken for nearly an hour, Philip, and I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but I would love to say a massive thank you for talking with me today. I know people listening are going to be amazed by your story and your modesty, your skill as an angler as well. But being able to get a little short time to see things and hear about things that you have seen has been an absolute privilege. When we fish in Scotland, because Emma and I come along too, that your enthusiasm when we come back at the end of the day, how have you got on? You're fascinated to hear how the day has gone, and your enthusiasm for that rubs off on all of us and keeps us in high spirit through the week that is ahead. So as somebody who's got to spend time with you, thank you for that. Thank you for talking with me today. And as I said, I know listeners are going to absolutely love your story. So, Philip, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Well, I've been very lucky, Peter, in my life to have a variety of fishing against a variety of quarry in many continents of the world. But to say that I'm a good fisherman is unfair. I've enjoyed fishing in many places and I've loved it. It's been great fun. But I'm not a good fisherman and I never will be. Thank you.
There's Philip's legendary modesty. But, well, everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this one. As ever, there's never going to be any charge for these. It's just wonderful being able to share these fabulous stories with people. So thank you for listening. There'll be plenty more coming very, very soon.
Thanks for listening to the Fly Culture podcast, brought to you in association with the Voice of Game Angling, Trout and Salmon, where Pete is the editor.